So we go straight into the first keynote, and I'm really glad to introduce Professor Mark Byron. I know him from my doctoral years in Australia and Sydney, and he's been a great academic inspiration as well as a great academic friend. We've had so many conversations before and after several conferences in Australia, and it's a real pleasure to have him here. And he's been very kind with his time and his availability. To introduce him, Professor Mark Byron is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Sydney and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. His research developing digital scholarly editions of complex modernist texts and their manuscripts includes the What module of the Samuel Beckett Digital Manuscript Project, or SBDP, as we say, BDMP. His current project, Modernism and the Early Modern Ages, has thus far produced the monograph Ezra Pound's Eurasian in 2014 and a dossier co-edited with Stefano Rosinoli on Samuel Beckett and the Middle Ages in the Journal of Beckett Studies 25.1 in 2016. Mark has edited Ezra Pound and Olga Rudge's The Blue Spill and with Sophia Barnes, and the forthcoming essay collection, The New Ezra Pound. He's the current president of the Ezra Pound Society, and his talk today is titled Between Bone, Stone, and Wood, Embodiment, Ecology, and Materialism in Contemporary Literature. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, before I begin, I'd like to express my profound thanks and gratitude to the conference organisers, Professors Orko Chattopadhyay, Jason Manjale, Ambika Ayadurai, and Nishant Choksi. Firstly, for inviting me to present a keynote talk at this meeting, and for giving me the opportunity to hear what everybody else has to say. I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great privilege to be here at IIT Gandhinagar. This is my first time in Gujarat, as it happens, and my first visit to India in almost 25 years. So it's a long time between visits. I'd also like to make special mention of the incomparable Swati Joshi, who has been a wonderful guide on my visit and has shown great hospitality. So I'm forever in your debt. I'd also like to express my thanks to the executive here at IITGN for supporting this wonderful event and the Indian Council of Social Science Research for their sponsorship. The timing of this conference is excellent with regard to some of what I present today, I think. I'd noticed before I arrived that the Convention of the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals was held here just a week ago on the topic of ecological connectivity. Finally, I'd like to thank the conference participants and audience members for being here today, and my primary job is not to test your patience too much, so I'll get straight into the talk. Okay, and this is a gesture to Orko, actually, to have a Beckett quote to kick things off. If only she could be pure figment, unalloyed. The themes of human subjectivity, embodiment, and the relation of self to world have taken on a measure of urgency in contemporary literature. As the global community is slowly waking up to the consequences of a century of oil and plastics, the pollution of the oceans and the atmosphere, and the inevitable rise in global temperatures, authors have developed strategies to absorb new theoretical work in their thinking on the ways in which human subjects interact with and influence their societies, ecologies, and the world of objects. Perhaps the biggest lesson to have arisen in recent theoretical work across a range of disciplines, thinking of philosophy, ecology, psychology, sociology, and so on, and absorbed in a raft of recent fiction writing, is the inherent and complex interconnectivity that structures our world and our movements within it. So the very prominent example of this would be the current pandemic crisis we're all living through. This illustrates the structuring feature of our world most vividly, where global travel, and I speak from very recent experience, government biosecurity regulations, epidemiology, product supply lines, stock exchanges, and rational and irrational behaviour towards our fellow humans all impact upon lived experiences in profound ways. This extends to basic concepts of ecology too. Some of you will have known that the Chinese government recently outlawed wild animal trading in response to the crisis and its alleged origins in the Huanan seafood wholesale market in Wuhan. This is an attempt to counter cross-species transmission of pathogens, an unfortunately common occurrence in many of the world's recent epidemic outbreaks. So the point, I guess, with relation to my paper is that the human-animal nexus is both a bridge and a divide, and the key really is identifying which relation is bridge and which is divide, and being respectful witnesses to the natural world and the limits of human intervention within it. Literature, and prose narrative in particular, tends to be a reflective and deliberative mode of engagement with the world, however urgent the themes might be within the text and in relation to the reader's habitus. Novels provide the opportunity to think through crisis as well as its wider implications, dilating time and crossing geographical space in ways that suggest how the transit of ideas, customs and bodies shape an understanding of the larger environments shared by narrator, character and reader and author. Literary scholarship, in turn, responds with its own range of approaches to these issues, turning to theoretical, philosophical, formalist, and other ways of thinking to structure different modes of understanding. Most germane to the theme of this conference and the title of my paper are theories of affect and of the human subject, and this would include phenomenology, eco-criticism, as well as new materialism. Some of this work will be familiar to many of you. But I'll sketch a brief roadmap here just to outline what I think might be of particular significance and utility in our discussions of affect, embodiment and ecology in recent literature, before I turn to three prose narratives that provide suggestive possibilities for further thinking on this topic. These are the three texts that I'll be talking about today principally. The first is Beckett's Ill Seen, Ill Said, a late prose work, 1982, that narrates the relationship between a woman and her desolate environment, particularly the ways in which affect moves between human and object. I'll then turn to two Australian novels. I'm guessing that most of you won't have read either of these novels, which is great for my purposes, that's no problem. Gerald Murnane's Inland, 1988, and Julia Lee's The Hunter of 1999. The complex relation between human actors and ecology is perhaps the most definitive relation in Australia's history, and both authors write at pivotal historical moments. So Murnane, 1988, this is the bicentennial of the invasion and colonisation of Australia, and Lee, 1999, it's the end of the millennium, almost, when thoughts turned very sharply to matters of ecological and technological endgames, not least an emergent concern at climate change and, of course, the Y2K scare, different kind of pandemic. But first, affect. The application of affect theory to the reading of literature, the so-called affective turn, arose in the early 2000s alongside recent renewed interest in phenomenology, particularly the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Scholars such as, I think I have some quotes here, yes, scholars such as Sylvan Tompkins, Lauren Berlant, Xian Yai and others explore how theories of affect developed from the foundational influences of phenomenology on later generations of theorists, developing a way of configuring affect freed from the particularities of individual sensibility and emotion. Brian Masumi also theorises affect as a range of states independent from individual interiority, existing in the relation between subject and world and translatable across different subjects. In affect's distinction from emotion, he follows the 17th century philosopher Spinoza, and in this sense, Masumi's work relates to scholarship in medieval and early modern studies on the passions in literary texts. Now, just a couple of examples I've put up here. Foremost, Susan James's quite brilliant book, Passion and Action, The Emotions in 17th Century Philosophy. But Masumi's debt to phenomenology, especially Merleau-Ponty and the concept of the openness of the world, is also very much in evidence. So there's a large and fascinating body of material here. Affect theory provides a useful foundation for the narratives at the centre of my talk today, as a means of evaluating how narrative subjects are open to the world in various ways. by relations with non-human actors as well as objects, and how these texts may induce readers to engage with them in new ways, in turn prompting new relations between the reader and the world, our world, and particularly some of its more pressing concerns with respect to ecology, human subjectivity, and the dignity afforded non-human agents. So this talk will focus, I guess, more on the somatic dimensions of phenomenology and affect theory, an immediate orientation towards embodiment and the relation to objects. New materialism has a role to play here. I won't give a blow-by-blow account of new materialism, but we can, of course, elaborate on this in discussion over the course of the conference. But in a nutshell, I'm using it in a way as an attempt to rethink the human-object relation in light of the critique of metaphysics, and Martin Heidegger looms very large in the corpus of new materialism, questioning some of the central tenets of the so-called Enlightenment project. More recent thinking in thing theory, object-oriented ontology, and post-humanism develops this earlier work, but provides a different scholarly inflection when applied to contemporary literature, particularly narratives in which the agency of objects begins to push back against the assumptions of human subjectivity and its configurations of its world. So this focus on embodiment and subjective states also takes on wider significance when examined in light of environmental crises, species extinction, pollution, climate change, and potential responses to them in what has become known as the ecological turn. This stems from the eco-critical revolution of the 1960s, embodied in such work as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That's a really fundamental text in all of this discussion. So these developments, singularly or together, have shaped the direction of literary scholarship in profound ways. Ecological themes transform the concept of the human in recent Australian fiction. And my two examples work at kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. One deals with ecology in a very distributed and global way, and the other one is extremely specific in the ecological situation it deals with. So there is an obvious topicality in these texts, given the national trauma, the Australian national trauma, experienced in the recent ecological crisis. This is what I'm talking about. You would have seen some of this on television. So the fires that engulfed the entire country, but particularly the southeast, killed 34 people, approximately 1 billion animals, and at least 19 million hectares of forest. If you want to put that in perspective, if you remember the Amazon fires that happened a couple of years ago, the area that was destroyed in Australia was 10 times the amount of the Amazon forest that was, more than 20 times the amount destroyed in the Amazon. So the somatic reaction to the fires ran a spectrum from the immediacy of firefighting and protecting properties to reactions to the choking smoke enveloping cities with some of the worst pollution on Earth. I think I have an image. There you go, there's central Sydney during the fires. You can barely see it. As well as the post-traumatic stresses that are still at work in the population. Australian literature rarely functions as a consolatory force. It prefers to challenge received wisdoms and to engage directly, even viscerally, with the prevailing structures of power in society at large or in smaller formations. And my examples today provide a challenge to ecological apathy. How are bodies, affective states, and the natural world arranged in such narratives, and what are the implications for our understanding of narrative fiction and its capacity to address the big questions facing the globe today? So from a localised perspective, I'll be trying to telescope out. So these questions demand new ways of thinking about concepts of identity and affect mediated through ecology. If this sounds a little bit familiar, it's because we have been here before. I'm thinking of the so-called pathetic fallacy, first identified by John Ruskin and considered to be a signature feature of particularly British Romanticism. This fallacy took the natural world as a kind of mirror for human subjectivity, mapping human emotional states onto such phenomena as storms. So, let's go back to that. You've got the Sturm und Drang movement that the British imported from Germany. You could see this in, say, book one of Wordsworth's The Prelude. There's a wonderful example of the Sturm und Drang there, where little William is in his boat out on the lake. But there are other examples too, dealing with, say, sunshine. So I think of, say, Coleridge's poem, This Lime Tree Bower My Prison, where there's a projection of emotional states onto less stormy weather. Okay, so this is very deliberate on my part. Beckett's critique of Romanticism is well known, but perhaps still has some new things to tell us. And his sustained mode of pitting human subjects against their material surroundings transforms the subject-object relation by ambiguating those very subjects and objects. Sorry, I'll just turn to this visual example of Sturm und Drang, Caspar David Friedrich, one of Beckett's favourite painters. Beckett's later prose especially is conducive to readings open to non-human agents and even objects as agents, what Jane Bennett called the deodand, that which falls to God. This is a medieval theological category that then shifted into legal discourse, an intermediary between human subjectivity and the world and the objects of the world. So both Gerald Murnane and Julia Lee display a full critical awareness of the pathetic fallacy, giving their protagonists opportunities to catch themselves falling for its charms. There is a specifically Australian inflection at work here. Australia was invaded and colonised at a point when British Romanticism was in full swing, and shaping attitudes towards the new and exotic ecology that proved both an existential threat and a ripe zone for exploitation. This is evident everywhere in colonial poetry and painting. This is just one example, where British sensibilities are overlaid upon an utterly incommensurate landscape. The nation still labours under this ideology. It's having become a kind of a central nervous system of the non-Indigenous human's place in the Antipodean world. So Murnane and Lee are amongst a large cohort of writers evaluating this attitude to ecology in a very critical mode, opening up new ways of thinking through the human ecological relation. So I'll just move on to Beckett's Ill Seen, Ill Said. So this late text is a foundational example of the post-human narrative, with its focus on images and vocabulary related to earth, rocks, mining, and archaeology. The displacement of human emotions by the force of objects upon its central protagonist, and a profound ambiguity in the narrator's capacity to shape the story. The narrator presents an observer's view of the lone woman in a remote cabin or hovel surrounded by standing stones and pastures. The cabin, its situation, careful, on, at the inexistent centre of the formless place. This is very auspicious beginnings. The standing stones, or the 12, surrounding the hovel provide mobile anchor points for the woman's movements, as they seem to follow her around across her terrain. The hovel itself is considered in quasi-archaeological terms, and the ground upon which the narrative is based comes into focus as the grounding of language. This is accomplished by virtue of the narrator's intensive mode of intertextual reference. I won't talk much about that today, and the increasing use of archaisms as the narrative proceeds. Images and references arise in a scene of geological time, marking out the woman as a product of, if not a constituent part in, the history of rock formation and erosion. So this process of becoming rock, if you like, embodies the dialectical relationship she seems to demonstrate with the 12 standing stones. This appeal to the inorganic as an alternate form of animation in Ill Seen, Ill Said returns the reader to some of the ancient topography of the Wicklow Mountains. This is Beckett's native district. So the cromlech of Glen Druid that you can see here is often invoked as a kind of Neolithic source of reference for Beckett. He used to go walking there with his father. It functions more as a model for a tomb or an enclosed space, what Beckett might call a true refuge, rather than any direct reference to the standing stones in the narrative. So in this sense, it's a kind of a distributed reference between the hovel and the grave site that the woman visits throughout the narrative. Megalithic archaeology becomes an especially acute source of the story's imagery, mediating the human and the inorganic, but very much in a new materialist mode of object autonomy. I think I have a quote here from Joshua Keating. While Beckett resists the romantic tendency to invest the landscape with personality, or to see it as a reflection of the human soul, the pathetic fallacy, he does respond to its mineral and inorganic qualities, finding here perhaps the traits which render it separate from the human realm. If the story's drama resides in the woman's movement between her abode and the landmarks surrounding it, the invasive narrative surveillance to which she is subject, the presence and agency of the 12 standing stones function as powerful counterpoints. Peter Boxall has mapped out the terrain between the woman's hut, the surrounding zone of stones, the pastures beyond, and the undefined paradise or outer zone, noting the inherent fuzziness in these topological demarcations, where looking erodes the very boundaries between zones upon which vision depends. So by looking, you're fuzzying up these distinctions. So this kind of concentric topography of hovel, stones, pastures, and paradise mimics the topography of megalithic stone circles, not least in the way the hovel's architecture echoes the orientation of particularly Celtic ancient tombs. The opening is situated between towards major celestial events. So the doorway of a tomb will be situated in the arc between the limits of sunrise and moonrise in the northeast and the southeast. The woman's odyssey consists partly in traversing the imaginary boundary lines between each zone, and in resisting the way the stones and the haze threaten to overwhelm both her and the landscape in an all-consuming white or dark. This deep association between the woman and the stone is established early in the narrative. She is drawn to a particular location where we're told stands a stone, a rounded rectangular block 3 times as high as wide, 4. This is presumably the headstone of her dead husband's grave. As the stone draws her outside, compelling her journey across the terrain, she mimics its immobility. She halts before it, we're told, as if of stone. This relation between the human agent and the grave marker unites the physical process of burial and the psychological process of mourning. As Robert Pogue Harrison puts it, the analogy between these two parallel rites of imminent internment rests on an intimate and age-old kinship between the earth and human inwardness, a kinship that makes the earth the caretaker of cultural memory and cultural memory the caretaker of the earth. So this capacity of the grave marker to function as a signification of mortality also affords it the ability to create a sense of place. Just to go on with Harrison, it's not for nothing that the Greek word for sign, sima, is also the word for grave. For the Greeks, the grave marker was not just one sign among others, it was a sign that signified the source of signification itself, since it stood for what it stood in, the grounds of burial as such. In its pointing to itself, or to its own mark in the ground, the sima effectively opens up the place of the here, giving it that human foundation without which there would be no places in nature. So this demarcation of place in its very immanence is brought into view mineralogically by the stone slab at the threshold of the woman's house, the standing stones in their mysterious motions, but above all in the headstone, which functions as a kind of gnomon or point of orientation, grounding potential signification and therefore narrative meaning. Able to find her way to the stone blindfolded, the woman takes on many of its characteristics. She too as if of stone, we're told. And the stone markers become an animating object as though governing her actions. When the stone, I might have that quote, when the stone draws then to her feet the prayer, take her. This blurring of the human and the inorganic extends beyond the woman's immovable face to her posture when she sits in her chair and other moments of extreme immobility. What we're told is, again, the rigid Memnon pose. This reference is to the 2 colossi guarding the mortuary temple of the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III at Thebes in Egypt, converging the human and the mineralogical. Beckett's fascination with Egyptian statuary on visits to Berlin also inform these historical associations. And of course, you can't help but recall Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias as well, the two giant feet in the desert without the rest of the human figure. I think I might have an image. Here we go. This is a bearded sphinx that Beckett saw in the Tel Halaf Museum in Berlin in 1936. Okay. So as the woman's ghostly smile is likened to true stone and the twilight scene is overtaken by universal stone, the Memnon pose serves as a kind of geological distinction. The colossi of Memnon are made of quartzile sandstone, And while the Wicklow Mountains of Beckett's nativity is largely composed of granite, this actually rests upon a substrate of quartzile sandstone formed during the Cambrian period about 500 million years ago. I think I might have a map there, when Ireland was submerged somewhere in the Iapetus Ocean. Wicklow's topography of solid igneous rock is undergirded by ancient sedimentary rock. This may be a reminder of the changeability between the apparent fixity of things. Geological change and the woman's metamorphosis throughout the narrative are cognate processes. The latter is modulated by the narrative I and its fallibilities, as well as the literary associations its voice cannot help but introduce into the text. This mutual influence of the woman and the stones distends both biological time and geological time, creating an indefinite narrative time in which the processes of change defy conventional measurement. So the woman's visage and stature become stone-like or stone-cold at one point, but she resists becoming pure figment. Her stubborn persistence to be seemingly always there, even when the eye is not looking, preserves her as if frozen in time and the space circumscribed by the fragmentary protocols of the text, as Christopher Longmire has put it. As an object that both anchors and stands outside the narrator's imagination, the woman stands apart from any deviser, but she is a figment in the most fundamental sense. Deviser and figment are words that come up a lot in this text. This word derives from the Latin figmentum, to be formed or contrived, and ultimately from Proto-Indo-European, the root word de, I'm going to guess its pronunciation, to form or to build. So it's kind of related to poiesis, I guess. This root also produces the Old English word dege, a female servant or housekeeper, as well as the Latin effigies, a copy, imitation, a likeness, or a statue, from which the modern English word effigy derives. Thus, the woman, perhaps once a servant or housekeeper, is a figment in the sense that she is a quasi-archaeological representation, statue-like in her immobility and affinity with the standing stones, contrived by a narrator despite her grounded essence resisting complete domination. So in this late text, Beckett produces an economy of affect that cites but displaces the romantic ideology of belatedness, mourning, and fragmentation. In its place is an economy of affect that comprises the woman, the stones, the narrator, and of course the reader. Agency is distributed across these narrative aspects where human subjectivity is shifted from its customary sovereign position, entering into a relation with objects that themselves are invested with agency. The ecology of the narrative, diminished to the scale of a hovel in a concentric lithic space, a stone space, provides a kind of ground zero for such a meditation on the possibilities of bare narrative. In this sense, ill seen, ill said is a kind of canvas upon which the other narratives of the post-human and distributed affectivity can throw some of their shade. So I'll turn to those now. Okay, I'll jump to that in a moment. So I'll turn to Gerald Murnane's 1988 novel Inland. It engages what I've called a plain style, as in a plain geographical space, that emerges from grassland ecologies rather than the more familiar romantic geographies of mountains, lakes, oceans, and so forth. So Inland situates the steppe ecology, as in the Eurasian steppe, this vast area, as a means by which to think through Murnane's familiar range of questions. What is it to write? For whom does the author write? And to whom does the narrator speak? How do the conditions of writing within narrative shape the effect of that narrative? So the novel concentrates on three specific grassland zones. The Hungarian Great Alfold or Pannonian Plain. I'll just point this out to you actually. It's an exclave. What you see in that sort of aquamarine colour is the vast Eurasian steppe. And he's talking about the exclave that really falls within the boundaries of Hungary, modern day Hungary. So we have that as one example, the Great Plains of South Dakota and northern Nebraska, and the vanishing grasslands of northern Melbourne County down in Australia. There we go, there's a nice map of Victoria. So he's talking about the grasslands that still exist in remnants around just outside of Melbourne, and then moving further out. There's an example. So by this careful calibration of geographic particularity with narrative method, Inland demonstrates the strange intimacy of thought and modes of expression joined across these vast distances. There's something really that really anchors them all together. This intimacy in the novel is literalised in a character that we don't hear much from, the so-called girl from Bendigo Street, whose fate in the narrator's life becomes the embodiment of this poetics. The narrative contours of Inland resemble those of the Puszta, the Hungarian steppe exclave, the steppe or the grassland. Apparent uniformity on the surface, but often disguising a deep history and ecology cultivated over time and recorded in the strata beneath the text's surface. So what I'm saying is his text and his style mimics some of the features of steppe and grassland ecologies. The narrator occupies at the beginning an estate house in Zsolnok County in the Hungarian Puszta for about the first quarter of the novel. He observes from his book-lined room the fields and the estate workers outside. At one point he's a writer, he writes to his editor, a woman called Anna Kristali Gunnarsson, who's a native of that part of Hungary, but who resides actually in South Dakota in the Calvin O. Dahlberg Institute of Prairie Studies. The narrative then shifts almost completely to Melbourne County, where the narrator reflects upon his childhood and his coming of age, recalling the influence of geography upon his rising amorous sensibilities, especially his proximity or otherwise to the Victorian grasslands in periods of transience when his family is moving around. The central thematic focus of the larger portion of the narrative settles upon the dawning affection he feels for the girl from Bendigo Street. Following his move away from the school at which they meet, he loses touch with her and later attempts to track down this nascent adolescent love interest come to nothing. The narrative concludes at a place called Fawkner Cemetery in Pascoe Vale on the outskirts of Melbourne, bordering the forest, where the narrator reflects upon this lost love. Her young brother's grave in Fawkner Cemetery acts as a kind of gnomon too, like the gravestone in Ill Seen, Ill Said, orienting the narrator's reflections on his youth and his processes of mourning what might have been. I don't think I have, there's some information about Hungary. Okay, the final paragraph of the novel is a direct but unmarked quotation of the final paragraph of Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights. If you remember, that's when Lockwood is standing in the cemetery. He's the recipient of Catherine and Heathcliff's story in the frame narrative, and he contemplates the Yorkshire moors at the graveyard in which the novel's two major protagonists are finally reunited. So the narrative of Inland, I'm going to claim, is conditioned upon the negative event. Things do happen to the narrator and are recorded and subject to reflection. His sequence of moving house during the formative years of adolescence certainly shapes the emotional contours of the novel, and the move away from the girl from Bendigo Street turns out to be the foundational trauma that precipitates access to a larger reservoir or field of memory. Yet it is understatement, lack of disclosure, missed declarations of affect and desire, of affection and desire, all captured figuratively in the way the narrator sort of looks at the world from an angle, looking askance at the physical world. This delineates the depth of feeling in the novel and has it play out at what would objectively be a minor event of adolescence into the life-shaping anguish generative of such profound but reticent passion. It achieves this combination of profundity and understatement by unifying the narrator's preferred topography of the grassland with the narrative preoccupations of the self-conscious act of writing. This is how individual emotion is transformed into a literary register of affect. So for Murnane, writing is the reportage, as he says, the reportage of the images of the author's mind, eliding the luxuries of psychoanalysis, sorry Olga, but it's not interested in psychoanalysis, and casting the mind into a topography able to be read as landscape in all of its hidden striations. So in my view, the place we commonly call the real world is surrounded by vast and possible infinite landscape, which is invisible to these eyes, but which I am able to apprehend by other means. The more I tell you about this landscape, the more inclined you might be to call it my mind. So this ontological vagueness fuses inner and outer worlds, textual landscapes and the mental images from which they spring, and also finds expression in the ambiguous transition between narrative subjects. The Hungarian manor house occupant at the beginning and the resident of Melbourne County are figures within the same narrative consciousness, joined by grasslands that disguise ecological and historical richness between their apparent uniformity. So this geomorphology shapes the central focus of the narrative, this relationship with the girl from Bendigo Street. As they begin to spend time together in his native district, the narrator gently attempts to understand her. Every few days she rewarded me by telling me quietly something that was unimportant in itself, but seemed a message from beneath the surface of her. Matters of surface, words, and depth feeling complicate the mutual implications of grassland and written language. The narrator reacts in the register of surfaces and depths, using these indexes as a way of navigating his own words and his understanding of those of his beloved. When I hear the silence that comes between my own words sometimes, I think of prairies or plains, as though all my words are being spoken from grasslands. But whenever I hear the silence that comes between the first 5 and the last 2 of the 7 words spoken to me by the girl from Bendigo, I think of depths. So those five words, if I can remember the quotation, is she likes you very much. Those are the key 2 words at the end. This sense of undiscovered depths governs the relationship through to its final moments, when the narrator makes it known that his family will be leaving his native district for the district beyond the Ovens and Reedy Creek, and the girl from Bendigo Street asks the distance involved. As the narrator reflects on this moment in a nearby cemetery many years later, he understands the depths of unstated words carry as much significance as the grassland topography of written words. The girl had asked me her question as though it was a small matter to her, but I had read in her face that it was not a small matter to her, and I have not forgotten today what I read in her face. The narrative becomes an understated elegy, based on subtle exchanges between 2 solitary adolescents, born upon a substrate of deep affect, the rock and soil that gives the grassland its topographical distinction. But how does grassland induce such a powerful affect? The common vision of the steppe is one of undifferentiated marginal land, not rich enough for sustained agriculture, and although often treeless, insufficiently arid to be classed as desert. So just this little quick tour of some of the world's great grasslands. So the vast Eurasian steppe, home to Turkic, Mongol, Altaic, and many other groups, has long cast a shadow over the civilizations of Europe, Persia, and China. Its essential mystery arises in its sheer size. As an ecological region of temperate grasslands and savannas, the Eurasian steppe includes parts of Romania and an exclave part, the Pannonian steppe or Pushta, in Hungary, but is most commonly associated with Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and certain parts of China, Xinjiang and Heilongjiang. The climate is semi-arid, hot summers and cold winters, and the poor soil supports grazing animals such as goats, sheep, camels, and occasionally yaks. Steppe geography also occurs in southern Africa, the so-called veld, and North America, of course, the prairie or the Great Plains, although these regions are rarely referred to by the term steppe. Perhaps the most striking characteristic across geography, culture, and climate is the unexpected diversity and richness lurking within an otherwise unprepossessing ecology. This is equally rich material for verbal and visual representation, and clearly a vital resource for Murnane's fiction, by which to suggest hidden depths to apparently uniform surfaces, whether those surfaces are memory, affect, mourning, testimony, or the representation of these in written narrative. So I'll just sort of draw back to a world historical view of the Eurasian steppe, which I think informs precisely what Murnane is doing here. The Eurasian steppe has marked the location of a threat to urban civilization since at least Roman times, where its seemingly autochthonous inhabitants emerged from its vast spaces to visit chaos upon the centres of culture. So there's a couple of visual examples of this fear. These marauders, on horseback, by caravan or foot, appear without warning with the promise of an ever-replenishing force. They come to represent a counterpoint to settled civilization and are often projected as an image of potential collapse, lurking within the very cultures and civilizations they were deemed to threaten. Here's another example. The abject twinning of the steppe people with the citizens of Rome, Byzantium, Baghdad, and Vienna sounds an echo across history back to the origins of language itself. So the widely accepted, it may not be unanimous, but it's a widely accepted theory of the Kurgan hypothesis, states that the family of Indo-European languages originated in the migrations from the European steppe in the 4th millennium BCE, from which Proto-Indo-European flourished and dispersed west and south. So this is just a bit of a couple of visualizations of this theory. And the Kurgan people of the Pontic steppe, this is north of the Black Sea, are also believed to have brought the domesticated horse to Europe, and coupled with some of the earliest known uses of the wheel, developed the warrior's chariot. So I don't know if I've got any more. Okay, so the word Kurgan actually comes from, it's a Russian word that refers to the burial mounds of the people who lived in the Kurgan civilization. So later migrations from this area would also include the Celtic tribes that were to settle Western Europe and the British Isles from about the 8th century BCE. Depicted as barbaroi by the Romans, such groups were instrumental in advancing matters of astronomy and gold and silversmithing. So this topography of vast wilderness that disguises many of the foundational technologies of civilization provides Murnane with a fertile store of images and historical resonances by which to develop his own narrative preoccupations in inland, but also in many of his other texts. Yet his focus centres upon the Pannonian exclave rather than the Eurasian steppe itself. So, oh, sorry, that's not the Pannonian exclave, that little part that I showed you before. And on the Hungarian people and their language. And of course, Hungarian doesn't belong to Indo-European family of languages, but the Finno-Ugric family. So Murnane's fascination with the Hungarian language, and legendarily he taught himself Hungarian late in life, thus serves specific purposes in this novel. It demonstrates Murnane's thinking across space and time, taking in vast narratives of human migrations and the melding of cultures and languages in his little story about remembering a lost childhood sweetheart. So it produces, from what might be called a minor literature, a reservoir of world historical themes, providing the bridge between individual sensibility and memory and the vast tectonic shifts in human history, even those, like the steppe itself, disguising a deep richness between a deceptively uniform surface. So I'll just turn to my last example of affect and ecology in this talk. And this is Julia Lee's 1999 novel, The Hunter. Its narrative is deceptively straightforward. The main protagonist, M, is a university research scientist attached to an unnamed laboratory. And he's sent on a mission to capture the DNA of the thylacine recently sighted in the Tasmanian Central Plateau. So that's that area, extremely rugged area. I might have some images of what it looks like. That's on top of the plateau. You can see here, this looks like Norway, doesn't it? It's so extreme and dramatic. Okay, so this is the object of his hunt, the thylacine, otherwise known as the Tasmanian tiger. And this was hunted to extinction when the last specimen died in captivity in 1936. So its name's thylacine cynocephalus, dog-headed pouched dog. So like all marsupials, it has a pouch in which the young are protected early in their life. So this was meant to have gone extinct in 1936 when this specimen died in a zoo. But there have been many unverified sightings ever since, raising the thylacine to this kind of mythical status, like the Yeti, I suppose, or the Sasquatch, or other kind of mythical creatures. The citer in the novel, a guy called Jarrah Armstrong, has recently disappeared, presumed dead. So M is lodging with the deceased man's wife in their house, and she suffers a deep depression and barely registers her own subjectivity. And M befriends the two children who have renamed themselves in the absence of their father. One is called Sass and the other one is called Bike, presumably because he likes riding his bike. And These kids run wild beyond the house, but they're very friendly and warm to M during his stays. In between, he takes 10-day hikes into the Central Plateau, where he sets traps and submerges himself into the local ecology to wait on a potential capture of the thylacine. At one point, M is called away back to Sydney unexpectedly, and during his absence, Sass is badly injured in an accident in which her bedding catches on fire. On his return several weeks later, M discovers that Lucy Armstrong, the mother, has broken down completely and has been institutionalised, and Bike, the boy, has been fostered out to relatives. He returns to the scene of his hunt to find that the National Parks Service is sending out scouts to the same area to follow up on a recently reported sighting. But in tracking the scouts, he learns they're not terribly interested in their task, and they spend their days just idly camping out by the river. M sights a female xylothine from the cave that he inhabits, follows it and kills it, taking blood samples and removing the reproductive organs, leaving the carcass for the Tasmanian devils. You all know what a Tasmanian devil looks like. These are very ferocious creatures. They're the largest carnivorous marsupials. He leaves the area with the specimens stored in high-tech nitrogen packs, and he walks past 2 unsuspecting scouts on his way out of the forest. End of the story. So the novel is written in a very plain, declarative style when narrating the thoughts and actions of M. His name is actually Martin David, but he's always referred to as M. And occasionally will turn to very florid prose, channeling M's description of the landscape or of the atmosphere at different times of day. The narrative point of view is in the third person, but swings between subjective and objective voices, almost always centred in M's perceptions and thoughts. The final hunt sequence is given an objective voice, with M's thought processes and strategies taking on a very forensic mood at the expense of any consideration of the ethical impact of his actions. So these narrative techniques undergird the deep moral ambivalence in M's activities, as well as the implied moral economy submerged almost as deeply as the thylacine is in the Tasmanian wilderness. The disappearance and presumed death of Jarrah Armstrong follows soon after his reported sighting of a thylacine, and the accident that befalls his daughter, Sass Armstrong, raises a suspicion that their bad luck may be due to some unstated malign influence. They live on the outskirts of a small rural community, notable to its hostility to outsiders and antipathy towards environmentalists. So be warned if you go to Tasmania. If you're a greenie, you may not get the reception you're expecting in some places. So it's a place of last things, establishing the themes of extinction and extermination. So here's the house. Here, a little bluestone house sits quietly on the edge of the rippling flats, and rising beyond the house is the steep, dark escarpment which climbs to the Central Plateau itself, the last house at the end of the last road. So you can hear echoes of Endgame in there, the world of last things. Now, Jarrah and Sass, father and daughter, share arboreal names. You've got the Jarrah tree on the left and the sassafras tree on the right up there. And this only signals more clearly that the reader's suspicions might have some grounding. Why are these the 2 characters who come to grief, who have violence committed upon them? So M's assignment is left undefined beyond that of the kill and sample collection as its goal. The reasons why a laboratory would want to acquire the genetic material of a marsupial long presumed extinct rather than a live capture, these are never revealed. And notions of genetic engineering are left unstated, but they're very prominently situated just out of view of the narrative. M's affinity with the land grows very quickly through the narrative, and his character invites certain kinds of sympathy as he navigates the extreme terrain of the Central Plateau. Yet his clinical execution and dismemberment of the thylacine tears away these readerly affinities with shocking directness. The relation of human subject to natural environment remains the central theme of the novel, where descriptions of M's process of becoming animal are counterbalanced by the indifference and apathy of the National Parks and Wildlife Service employees and the aggressive attitudes of the town's loggers and miners. So the majesty of nature is given priority in the narrative, only to have its crown jewel rendered murdered before the eyes of the reader in the novel's final pages. Any sense of the dignity of the wilderness, the forest and its fauna is remorselessly torn away, ultimately demonstrating the deep hypocrisy embedded in romantic ideology and its reverence for the sublime. The hunter invites symbolic and perhaps even allegorical interpretation in the way it presents a deep human ambivalence to ecology. In one sense, this is the history of colonial settlement of Australia, where British agricultural practices were introduced to often catastrophic effect, and the endemic value of the continent's varied ecosystems brushed aside in favour of cotton, wheat, beef, and sheep farming. But there is another related discourse at work in this narrative, perhaps bearing an even more insidious implication in its deep submergence. This is what this image refers to. The characters in the novel are presented more or less stereotypically as Tasmania's modern population. None are Indigenous, and none show even the slightest sign of interest in anything related to Tasmania's unique Indigenous history. There's a commune of hippies that turn up at some point. Even they're not interested in Tasmania's Indigenous history. The thylacine is a zoological cognate of the full-blooded Indigenous Tasmanian, hunted to extinction with even greater efficiency in the 19th century. So M's stalking and pursuit of the thylacine through the Tasmanian high country echoes the infamous Black Line formed by settlers, convicts and soldiers back in October 1830, where a front moved south and east across Tasmania to corral the existing tribes into the Tasman Peninsula, designated as an Aboriginal reserve by Governor George Arthur. And that's Governor Arthur is the person after whom Port Arthur is named, that infamous penal settlement. So they basically moved all the way through here and pushed the people down into the Tasman Peninsula. That was the idea. Right, so the Indigenous Tasmanian population was decimated by massacre and disease from a pre-colonial population of, the estimate is maybe 15,000 people, until the death of the final full-blooded Indigenous Tasmanian, this woman Truganini, in 1876. So Romantic ideology has its own dark absence. The logic of total domination over ecology, which functions as a kind of the converse of the horror vacui, the overwhelming experience of mountains, valleys and oceans that we get during Romanticism and raised to some kind of metaphysical significance by Edmund Burke in his work on the sublime. But we also see it in such authors as Wordsworth, Herman Melville, Percy Shelley and many others. M's reaction to the immense valley before him, he calls it primordial civic planning, hints at the dark absence of human inhabitation and provides a direct thread from Indigenous dwelling and the thylacine. In his only direct reference to the land's first people, in this long, I won't read it out, in this long quote, M notes a subtle human intervention in the land, leading him to a direct association with human extermination, legally sanctioned, but that haunts the land. So the point here is that a little island off the coast of Tasmania, DeWitt Island, was originally designated as a place in which the Indigenous population would be gathered and deposited. Then when the thylacine was becoming extinct, exactly the same proposal was made. So this, in governmental terms, there's a direct association between the Indigenous people and the thylacine. So M's reaction here suggests a receptivity to larger forces of history and ecology, opening up a discourse that drives the narrative to its inhuman conclusion. The thylacine's extermination is foretold in the history of colonial displacement and massacre. So M's quest for the last member of a presumed extinct species, raised to almost metaphysical proportions, associates the hunter with such texts as, say Herman Melville's Moby Dick. He thinks of extensive searches undertaken by the World Wildlife Fund, as well as private buccaneers and pipe dreamers, and the verdict of zoologists that the animal's extinction is assured by virtue of habitat fragmentation, competition with wild dogs, disease and hunting. M takes on the challenge, though, asserting there's Caspar David Friedrich again. He asserts there is always new history to be made, and he hones what he calls his all-seeing eye, exercising his own godliness as the sort of the metaphysical hunter. So the direct reference here, all-seeing eye, will have some of you remember Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Nature, Again, I won't read it, but you can see what I'm getting at here. M's rapacity is antithetical to the Emersonian respect for the natural world and the desire to view it transcendentally. And he uses the same figure, the transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all, and the universal being circulates through me. Rather, M occupies the material stratum of blood and bone, where the cruel shock of his killing the mythical animal and extracting its genetic material recalls such speculative narratives, recent ones like Jurassic Park, for example. As Russell Smith has deftly elucidated, the deep betrayal of nature and its human subjects in the administration of science, devoid of bioethical considerations, also calls up the spectre of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But in the final assessment, the ecological outrage committed by M in his obedience to his employers in the biotech industry is the epitaph to the human outrage committed a century earlier upon Tasmania's First Peoples. The land, its fauna and its people are inseparable, and the violence of colonisation reaches its logical conclusion in the killing of an unlikely survivor, bearing a symmetry impossible to ignore, much as history would like to do so. So just to bring this together, how do the novel's themes intersect with its considerations of affect and identity, specifically through the ecological lens? M's affective economy consists of metaphysical speculation and literary references embedded in his response to the land. At various times during his quest, he fancies a kind of fusion with the ecology around him. That's Russell Smith's wonderful essay on Frankenstein and the Hunter. So he experiences an Emersonian expansiveness. He sits and feels his body grow light, disappear, so now there is no skin between himself and the plateau. He is nowhere, everywhere, so again he's echoing Emerson's language. M turns to respiration a little bit further down in this long quote, sensing the air cool as it flows over the moisture in his nostrils, his belly swells, then the same air, now a little warmer, flows out again, returning him to an embodied sensorium required to fulfill its quest in hunting down an adversary. The plateau signifies the romantic ideology of nature, a place calm and pure with space enough for a man to think, as M tells us. He deploys these stereotypes to contemplate geological time, establishing an effective relation whereby the human lifespan is found wanting. This quotation illustrates that very nicely. You'll hear in the final sentence the conflation of John Donne's famous declaration, no man is an island, with some of the themes of Shakespeare's Tempest. Perhaps a bough might break off in a storm or a creek overflow after sustained and heavy rain, but even those changes, still easily accommodated, were rare. And as for the cataclysmic changes, the meteors, volcanoes and earthquakes, when did they happen? Every odd millionth year. Not like a man's life, thinks M. If a man's life were an island, it would be uninhabitable. So M's attachment to the human sphere is evident in a range of literary and biblical references, such as when he laments his situation climbing up the escarpment. That's the John Donne reference. No man is an island entire of itself, etc., etc. So M says, I have been forsaken, he thinks. The world conspires against me. I did not ask for much, did I? No. Other men have asked for more, and still I am denied. So you can hear in this Job, Jeremiah, Christ's final words at the crucifixion, and of course Peter's denial of Christ as well. These are all put to the service of an abject self-pity. However, upon reaching the plateau, a phase shift occurs between a pale moon, where, as if under ghostly instructions, he seeks out a pile of wallaby scats and makes a paste to disguise his scent. So stretching out his arms and imagining himself airborne, M leaves behind the romantic ideology of nature and assumes the phase of becoming animal. This is his weapon against his adversary, to occupy her world and assume its affects, and thus to lurk undetected until the time to strike is upon him. So the process by which M becomes animal begins with a familiar demonstration of bushcraft. So he covers himself in the paste of animal dung to disguise his scent, he marks trees to guide him in and out of the forest, and he sets traps and snares with precision and subtlety. His acute sensibility to the region's ecology and geomorphology is evident in his identification of various animal scats. So famously, wombats have cubic scats, so unmistakable. And he also talks about finding the scats of Tasmanian devils full of hair and bone because they're carnivorous. He identifies paw prints in the muddy earth, and he makes a deliberation on which pad or pathway to follow. He drops his pack and gets down on his hands and knees and looks around, sniffs, pulling cool air across his nasal membranes. So before, breathing was in the service of romantic ideology, and here it's about becoming animal, getting down and dirty in the landscape. So this action leads M to discover human remains hidden in the undergrowth, presumably those of Jarrah Armstrong. This pulls him out suddenly of becoming animal and induces a human response where he erects a kind of a makeshift grave marker. Here lies J.A., Jarrah Armstrong, may he rest in peace. So M observes the steep cliffs of the escarpment as dolerite deposits. These are in fact the largest deposits of dolerite in the entire world, produced by massive volcanism during the breakup of the... There they are. During the breakup of the Gondwana supercontinent in the Jurassic period. There's an image of what was Gondwana, and that slowly breaks up during the early Jurassic. You might also note that the Deccan Traps are dolerite deposits as well, so that's a nice geomorphic affinity between Australia and India. Dolerite is the substance that also produces bluestone. And of course, we remember that's the material from which the Armstrong house is built. And it's also the stone from which Stonehenge is built. So there's another nice sort of geological link going on there. So M performs what he calls his favourite trick on the dolerite platform when, quote, he changes shape, swallows the beast, imagining himself growing thick fur and a tail. So M's attempt to merge with the ecology produces an effective chain of dream and memory, where a potent emblem of thylacine is located in the ghosts and dreaming of long ancestral animal memory seeping into M's consciousness. So he asks himself, do tigers dream? And this tiger, reputedly the last of her kind, what does she dream of? The scent of a mate? Or does she have the same dream he has, the only dream he has? Or at least the only dream that he ever remembers, the running dream, where he's being chased for hours by an unknown foe, where he has to hide in bushes and hold his breath. Elsewhere, M engages the thylacine in imaginary conversation. He calls it the romancing of his prey, as though able to access the hereditary memory of an entire species epitomised in this last specimen. M's technical engagement with the material facticity of his world means that individuation wins out over in his execution of the Tasmanian tiger. This marks his breach from an effective relation with his ecology, deferring instead to the biotech narrative lurking at the edges of the novel. M muses on the thylacine, wavering between an image of her mangy species degeneration and a nobility that makes her a worthy adversary. M too is the last of his own line. He remembers a girlfriend earlier in his life and a terminated pregnancy, so he's single and alone. M draws from the reservoir of human techne as he waits for his quarry, taking to carving designs into bone from the cache using the point of his knife. It is fine, intricate work, well suited to the art of waiting. And of course, there it is. And of course, bone carving is among the earliest forms of artistic representation we have. He also gathers flowers and feathers to decorate the lair that he creates while he waits for the thylacine. He begins to invent new words for natural phenomena, but soon gives that up. The inadequacy of language leads him down a slippery slope until he is almost persuaded never to talk again, like some kind of monk. So M's final application of technique and skill occurs when he executes and eviscerates the thylacine, removing her reproductive organs, but he is unable to shake the bare fact of the gulf dividing the living from the dead. He observes her body as he would the body of a friend laid out in the morgue, we're told, reflecting on how her stillness is obscene. That's the final quote there. The obscenity is belongs to M, though, as he trails and finally desecrates the long human history of marking death, where the gravesite produces a rich symbolic economy from the horrifying absence of human passing to be passed down generations in a history of affect, the lifeblood of collective and individual identity. So I'll wrap this up really quickly. There's a lot to talk about and link between these texts, but the three novels I've considered today I think feature many of the ways in which affect, embodiment, and materialism are negotiated in recent fiction. The woman becoming stone in Beckett and Julia Lee's figure M, they both deploy the historical body of phenomenology. And Murnane's narrator, who mediates actual and imaginary steppe ecologies, resonates with the world-making capacity of new materialism. Novels are worlds of their own, whether we read them as autonomous, so that would be the tradition of the liberal humanist novel perhaps, or as negotiations with the reader to engage in a process of world making. So we might think of reception theory or phenomenology. The ways in which contemporary narratives engage with the ecological discourse of Australia, a troubled one, haunted by genocidal massacres, as well as profound ecological harm wrought by non-Indigenous agricultural practices, land clearing and habitat encroachment, navigate between the liberal humanist subject of the novel form and the effective and materialist negotiations made by character, narrator, and ultimately reader in forging new ways of world-making. So far from dead, perhaps the contemporary novel, in its potent capacity to prosecute these discourses, is the form, ironically, possessed of hope. Okay, thank you very much.